Welcome, everyone. It's really nice to see so many familiar faces and grateful to have so many students here, and we look forward to your participation in this discussion. This discussion is being recorded by BYU Radio, and it will be broadcast this Friday at 9 a.m. You can find it online at byuradio.org or on Sirius XM Channel 143. Now, a couple of things of introduction. We have two speakers with us today, Paul Westover and Matt Wickman. Scott Springer was originally scheduled to be one of the speakers today and encountered a family emergency that he's attending to. And so Matt Wickman graciously offered to speak on, well, not on his behalf, but in his place. Anyway, thank you, Matt. I'm going to introduce these two gentlemen by reading a short biography of each of them. Matt Wickman is founding director of the BYU Humanities Center and associate professor of English. His interests range widely across and even outside the humanities, and he has written on a wide variety of subjects, bridging literature and history, philosophy, law, mathematics, and more. One of the ways he consolidates these broad interests is by focusing on Scotland's interdisciplinary culture of enlightenment in the 18th century and after. Paul Westover joined BYU's faculty in 2008 after completing his PhD in English at Indiana University, a notorious hotbed for interdisciplinary 19th century studies. He specializes in the British Romantic period, the first heyday of Gothic fiction. Dr. Westover is the author of Necronomicon. That's the Lovecraft, is the author of Necromanticism, published last year by Palgrave Macmillan, A History of Death-Obsessed Literature and Literary Tourism. My name is Carl Sederholm. I am an associate professor of humanities in the Department of Humanities Classics and Comparative Literature. Also a specialist in the Gothic, but more in the American tradition. So today we're talking about the Gothic. And the Gothic has it relates very closely to notions that we have about horror. The two terms are often used interchangeably. I'm distracted by that, sorry. And Gothic, like its counterpoint horror, is a term that people think they understand pretty well. When scholars turn their attention to these terms, however, they tend to disagree over the precise meaning. Gerald Hogel, for example, remarked that the Gothic is a highly unstable genre, one that scatters its assumptions, conventions, and components everywhere. David Punter, in a similar vein, described the Gothic as a writing of excess. Just what is it about this style of writing that makes it so difficult and so challenging? As we discuss this topic today, I think you'll find that we won't necessarily leave you with an easy definition of what the Gothic is, but I hope you'll have an understanding of maybe why it's so complicated to understand and some of its manifestations in European culture. So to begin, the Gothic is difficult to define. What are some of the ways we might go about defining the Gothic for this audience?
I'm having trouble deciding where to direct my gaze here.
Ignore me.
No, I'm glad that you begin with some caveats and problems of definition, right? One of the problems is simply that we've got 2.5 centuries now worth of cultural production that could be called Gothic. But the stuff doesn't all look the same, right? Different programs, lots of different varieties. And I should say also this is a Cafe CSE discussion, which is to say we're supposed to be talking about Europe, but both Matt and I are British specialists. Now, that's probably okay because the Gothic seems to have originated in England, and we can talk about this and what the timeline is. But even within Britain itself, there are interesting things going on. Scottish literature in particular has a Gothic strain that Matt specializes in and can speak to. So having posted all of those caveats, what are some things across this vast range of cultural production that we can say different kinds of Gothics have in common? Do you want to take the first stab?
Go ahead, answer the question you pose and I'll kind of jump in with something in a moment.
Okay, so the first self-described Gothic novel was from the 1760s. Okay, it's Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto. And by Gothic, he more or less meant medieval or faux medieval. So the idea is you set the story in this medieval setting, and by doing that, you're able to displace the story onto kind of a long ago and far away. Right from the start, the genre uses medieval architecture. It loves secret passages, doors that mysteriously slam, things that go bump in the night, strange apparitions, right? So it is the literature of fantasy and of horror and of, we might want to say, things that cultures either want to repress or can't manage to deal with head on. And so transmogrify into some kind of weird, fantastic form. Is that a good start?
That's a good start. One thing I'd add to that, I like how you say that for Walpole, really the founder or one of the founders of the mode we now call the Gothic genre, Gothic meant faux medieval. That's true. Gothic, the term also was a term used in histories to designate this group of sort of barbarians on the continent that resisted Roman rule. So Gothic meant both medieval and it meant non-classical, uncivilized, uncouth, which then was a way of talking also about not only those that were not the Romans, but also those who were our forebears in the past, you know, the dark ages out of which we enlightened people come.
Yeah. So Walpole takes a really interesting gamble, right? This is right at the moment when the modern novel is being invented. And already he's saying the future of this new form may have to do with the pleasures of regression, right? To reclaim primitive emotions of fear and wonder and things that supposedly we've left in our past, right? Which turn out to be very present even in our supposedly enlightened age.
You know, it sounds as though one of the things about the Gothic that you guys have both talked about is this faux medievalism, and with this idea that the Gothic also refers to the Goths and this resistance to the larger culture around it. It took me back to Punter's definition about the Gothic as a writing of excess. And I wondered if maybe you could both comment about this issue of excess. In what ways does it exceed conventional expectations about maybe the novel or about cultural assumptions, things of that nature? Yeah.
I think there is in Punter's very definition, there's an interesting kind of history to that term, as far as I understand it. This notion of a writing of excess was, unless I'm mistaken, it was a French notion in the early 20th century amongst the Surrealists. There was a group of Surrealists, André Breton, René Magritte, Louis Aragon, who were fascinated with the Gothic. And the Gothic that fascinated them was the late 18th century English Gothic. It was Anne Radcliffe, Matthew Lewis, and there's a really great essay of Radcliffe's called, I think it's called On Superstition and Poetry or something like this, where she talks about the Gothic and she differentiates between terror on the one hand and horror on the other. And the terms are a bit fuzzy. What she means more or less is that terror, which is that which fascinates us by being hidden or obscured, whereas horror or the grotesque is excessive. We find it hideous. It's too apparent. So a terror novel for her would be one of her own novels, you know, where the heroine sees shadowy things in a large castle, and there's something terrible there, but you don't know what it is. Whereas, say, a Matthew Lewis novel of horror would be one where violence is very overtly manifest. And the Surrealists in the 20th century loved the Gothic, but they were especially drawn to the horror vein of it. You know, fascination with excess, cultural excess, things that are cultural representations that are almost an avenue into different ways of thinking, different ways of experiencing the world. Punter, I think, is drawing upon the early 20th century's fascination with the Gothic in defining the Gothic as, you know, horror and the writing of excess. I think Anne Radcliffe might say, "Not so fast, David."
Yeah, that's right.
But yeah, I'm sure she had a very much lower voice than that. So.
and to point to the early 20th century is also to say you're pointing at a moment post-Freud.
Good.
Right?
Yeah.
Because it seems to me that the Gothic is doing things that look Freudian before Freud is there. You know, and when Freud's theories of mind came on board, all of a sudden there were new tools for reading these things. You know, subterranean caverns, right? It seems ready-made, right, to be a figure of the subconscious, of repressed sexual energy, whatever you wanted to do. It was really easy to transfer the symbol language. And so then the Gothic looks like precisely the id out of control, right? Desires that cannot be acknowledged, or the return of desire that's been repressed. That is certainly one strand in this tradition, but it's not the only strand, as Matt points out.
And in fact, I mean, I'm so glad Paul raised the Freudian angle onto this, because you look at Freudian case histories, you know, where Freud's developing a lot of these ideas about the unconscious. There's something very Gothic about these case histories. They involve some kind of repressed desire, something scandalous and hidden in a family history often, some kind of sense of danger or threat. So much so that you wonder whether Freud presents us now with a set of tools for discussing the Gothic, or whether psychoanalysis is merely a later permutation of the Gothic.
And certainly Freud has been reading Gothic texts.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
One of his most famous essays on the uncanny, right, the Unheimlich, begins with an analysis of an E.T.A. Hoffmann story.
That's
right. A German Gothic story.
That's right. Good. Excellent.
So, yeah, there's a chicken and egg thing here.
Yeah.
Well, what's interesting, too, as we think about Freud's involvement here is, as Paul pointed out, I mean, he did read Gothic texts and wrote The Uncanny, and as Matt pointed out, you know, his case studies read like Gothic stories in a very real way, and there's a worry in Gothic fiction, generally speaking, about things that are hidden and things that might come out at a moment when we don't want it to. Maybe family secrets or national secrets or personal secrets. I don't want to just focus on secrets, but the Gothic is often about uncovering what's hidden, deliberately so. And it's fascinating to me thinking about this in terms of psychoanalysis, because does psychoanalysis on one level or another represent an extension of this Gothic way of thinking or of storytelling? And one of the things I want to talk about next is I want to think about some of the things that the Gothic might be responding to. I mean, not that it has to always be responding, but sometimes the Gothic tends to be popular at times of crisis, national, cultural, political crises, and it tries to fit its way into this conversation by asking hard questions about the nature of these things. And one of the things I'm thinking of is the Gothic is often identified as something that comes out of Enlightenment thought. Or a better way to say it is in response to Enlightenment thought. And so what I'm thinking about here in this question is, how does the concept of the Gothic factor in to Enlightenment notions of thought or reason? And maybe a related question would be, how does the Gothic respond to questions about the supernatural? And include religion in that if you'd like.
Okay, great. I'll just say, I'll start with saying something, and then Paul, you're welcome to jump in. Maybe I can come back, circle back around. To the question first of the Enlightenment as kind of the natural corollary, kind of the dialectical corollary to the Gothic, I think that it's the common juxtaposition in the late 18th century is Enlightenment on the one hand, Romanticism on the other, and back to where Paul began with this faux medieval. I mean, Romanticism is a great synonym for faux medieval, you know, kind of the culture of romance.
Romance revival.
Exactly right. You know, and the Gothic was really a term for Romanticism before Romanticism existed as a term.
Mm-hmm.
So the Gothic is the first way of categorizing Romanticism, and the Enlightenment was really kind of the difference from that category. And I think what's interesting about this is that you can imagine the Gothic then in a couple different ways. In relation to Enlightenment. One is that it's simply Enlightenment's other. If Enlightenment is rational, the Gothic is about passion. If Enlightenment uncovers secrets, the Gothic is about what remains obscure and mysterious. If the Enlightenment is about the demystification of old beliefs in the supernatural, the Gothic is about their recurrence or their endurance into the present. So one way is to imagine them as antitypes. Another way is to say that the Gothic is the term that the Enlightenment gave for the murky pasts out of which the modernity had come. So that the Gothic is a way of doing history and narrative before you have a full-blown set of explanatory mechanisms to explain what that history was. Someone was going to say about that. What was it? I'll come back to a minute.
It almost sounds like you're describing the Freudian repression in a way.
Well, yeah.
The Gothic is what they termed the things that don't
that's
come
right.
under
that
the...
Here, I
against
guess with
which
this-
Enlightenment defines itself.
Yeah. In fact, if you look at
Against the, yeah.
if you did a schematic run of novel types, you actually can see. I mean, Franco Moretti has done this in his book Graphs, Maps, Trees. You know, in the late 18th century, the most popular genre was the epistolary novel. Then at the very end of the century, turn of the century, it was the Gothic novel, which gives way to the historical novel. And that's interesting schematically, you know, to think about the move from the Gothic to the historical. The Gothic is history before history has fully codified itself, one might say.
Gosh, there were so many pieces to that. I don't quite know where to pick up. But I like...
Any one of them would be great.
Well,
You
I
know, they're all
appreciated that
interesting.
Matt put the Gothic in relationship to Romanticism and the larger stories we tell about reactions against Enlightenment.
Mhm.
Because on one hand, yeah, it seems very clear, at least Walpole from the beginning defines his project in this way. He says, our literature is becoming too reasonable, too tied to fact. So there's this account of human nature that doesn't seem to really account for everything that we experience, right? The imaginative side of life, the emotional side of life, the spiritual side of life. And so there needs to be a literature that expresses it. Gothic's an example of this, and this is also a way we often define Romanticism. And yet, it's interesting, maybe this is too specialized, I'm talking about my own disciplinary hobby horse, but it's interesting to me actually that for a long time, people who study Romanticism did not want to talk about the Gothic. Precisely because it seemed sub-literary in some way, right? The Gothic novels of the 1790s were arguably the first modern bestsellers. Okay? And this is not highbrow stuff. And so the Gothic was always the drunk uncle in the attic of Romantic studies that no one wanted to acknowledge.
How Gothic.
Yeah, exactly, right? Or maybe I should say the mad woman in the attic, right? Depending on how we want to discuss it. But anyway, it seems to me that any discussion of Romanticism is pretty impoverished if you don't bring in this sort of darker strand, which in fact was incredibly powerful and incredibly popular.
Yeah.
You mentioned another idea, though, and maybe we can turn the conversation that the Gothic seems to emerge in moments of crises and moments of transitions. And there are a couple ways to think about it. I would note that there's a flowering of Gothic in the 1790s, French Revolution. There's a flowering of Gothic in the 1890s. Books like Dracula, Stevenson's Jekyll and Hyde.
1884, yeah,
There
1885,
are a whole bunch of them at the end of the century, right? In
Yep.
the sense, again, of sort of a moment of transition. So it does seem like in a moment when culture is changing really quickly and there's some pretty radical ruptures, that Gothic becomes a way to talk about that, right? About relationships between past and present, relationships between things that are supposedly set behind us in some kind of revolution, be it political or intellectual or whatever, but things that won't quite go away. I don't know if I articulated this well, but...
No, it's interesting. It's
Does that sound
true.
right?
Yeah, right. And we can pick up on that also. And one last thread you brought up, Carl, was about religion.
Yes.
You know, I'll just mention a couple texts I know. The Scottish tradition, one of the classic Gothic novels is James Hogg's Private Memoirs and Confessions of a Justified Sinner, which tells a story of a murder. It's a fratricide. One brother murders another. And it tells nominally the same story twice from two perspectives, kind of a third-person perspective and then a first-person perspective. And you know, the devil takes on bodily form as a place in the novel, and it's examining kind of the extreme fanaticism of a certain segment of the Presbyterian or Calvinistic, in Scotland Calvinistic faith. Very much involved in the question of religion, what religion can do to people. It's very psychological. Another place you find it, though, interesting, this kind of Gothic religious strain in Scotland isn't a novel at all. It's Robert Burns's poem Tam O'Shanter, 1790, you know, where the main character, Tam, is, you know, on a horse after kind of a night spent too long in the tavern. And he passes a church, a ruined church, and there in the church there's a party, but the party is of demons, and the devil's playing the bagpipes, and some witchy ladies are dancing, and again, it's bringing out kind of the religious element to all this as being part of what's repressed.
Interject, Matt? People know the story of Tam if they don't know the poem, because it gets recycled in the Legend of Sleepy Hollow.
Yeah, good.
Right down to the race to the bridge, right? So, yeah, so religious aspect is one. If Scott Springer had been able to be here today, this is what he works on: French fiction, post-French Revolution. What happens when you decide as a society, we are, as of today, secular, right?
By fiat.
Right. Well, it doesn't work, right?
Right.
And so he talks about the way sort of crypto-Catholicism is working its way out in fiction, right? But there is also, as we mentioned before, the political rupture. And you made me think of Washington Irving, which may be, well, if not our first important Gothic American writer. I don't want to say that because there's Charles Brockton Brown clear back in the 1790s. But our first genuine American international bestseller, right? Okay. Who's trying to create a sense of a landscape in America that can have history, that can have heritage, that can have ghosts, right? But what are the ghosts in Washington Irving, right? There are a couple of kinds. One is ghosts that have to do with the American Revolution, right? Where maybe we're back to this Freudian story again of parent-child conflict after all, right? Where the child nation is broken away from the parent nation. And so you have these weird things happening, so that Rip Van Winkle wakes up from his dream. What does he find? On the tavern sign where there used to be King George III, it's now the same face, but it's been repainted, and now it's George Washington. One George has become another, right? And the question is this really different, right? Or do we just have a new kind of king, and what's going on here? Yeah. But the other ghosts are Native American ghosts, right? Dutch ghosts, earlier settlers in the Americas, which is to say, the ghosts of people that had to be displaced in order for us to create this civilization that we're trying to build from scratch. So,
great.
It's interesting to me the way, again, thinking about this question that we've been discussing, that one of the things that's emerging from the conversation thus far, one of the things I want to add to, is that the Gothic seems, on a very important level, it seems to preserve memory about something. Maybe not in the same way as a written history of something tries to preserve it, but it preserves the memory of something. It's haunted, let me say it even better. It's haunted by the memory of something that it's tried to repress in a way. The Gothic won't let go of these attempts. It's like you mentioned about the French Revolution, right? That, the French Revolution, we're going to get rid of all of the Catholic Church. We're going to get rid of faith and all this kind of stuff. And the Gothic preserves that, but it doesn't preserve it by saying, I'm going to write a bunch of religious novels. It preserves it by bringing belief in the supernatural out through narratives in sometimes oblique ways, sometimes symbolic or metaphorical ways, whatever. But it comes up against a very real problem, and I want to mention something about this. Years ago when I was doing research for my dissertation, I was researching this similar problem in America, the shift, the problems in the Enlightenment and how different beliefs in the supernatural get preserved. And I found this essay that was published in an American magazine where this guy says, this is 1820s, the writer says, finally, America has become enlightened. And he says, there's only one problem, is that we preserve superstitious belief in our language. And he uses the example of thank my lucky stars. He says, if only we could get rid of that expression, then we will finally be triumphant in our enlightenment. And
I'm not sure I've used that expression in my life. Am I therefore enlightened?
I guess, yeah. Matt. But it's interesting the way that I think the way I read his point anyway is this frustration, but you can't get rid of it, that we have expressions that preserve this kind of belief in the supernatural and what have you. Irving is very big on this, and others. Now, Matt, I want to go back to you for a second because you mentioned, talking about the Scottish Gothic, and you mentioned Hogg's wonderful book, and you mentioned Tam O'Shanter, and I wanted to give you the opportunity to mention any other things in the Scottish tradition that might be interesting that we may have encountered in our experience, like Tam O'Shanter, or are there any other important thinkers or writers In other words, tell us some more about the Scottish
Okay.
Gothic.
Yeah, that's called a setup question.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Carl. No, but let me respond to something you said. It's interesting about the way the Gothic becomes a mode by which things that have not been entirely articulated are preserved, or things that have not been excised make their appearance again. One of the things that you find in Hogg's fiction, Hogg is seen as a figure who produced a lot of his fiction in response to the very large shadow cast by Walter Scott. There's a very good book called Scott's Shadow about Scott's impact in the 19th century, not only in Scotland, but in writing more broadly. And Scott was a writer of many things. Among the most famous things are historical fictions, where he has incredibly rich texts that narrate some kind of transformation of a past state into the present, where you kind of reconcile the past and the present. Hogg was interested in what does not reconcile itself. And so the way that those forms take root, you'll find in Hogg not so much a third-person narrator who's able to explain kind of the movement of history through time to arrive at the present, but Hogg's all about these enduring strains that never quite disappear or dissolve or go away. As you'll find like narrators saying, I found this really weird manuscript, what do I do with it? Or I heard it said by some old lady that the following, and here comes a long story, and these are all manifestations of oral traditions, other kinds of records that haven't been vetted by an omniscient, enlightened narrator, and that therefore can't be dismissed, that are still a part of the present day. I mean, he's one of the major ones. I'll mention two more quickly. One of them is Robert Louis Stevenson, Jekyll and Hyde. Paul mentioned this. Great, great text. Interesting about that, it was a Gothic text, not so much of repressed mores. Yeah, that's part of it. Jekyll's enlightened, and Hyde is a figure who has a darker side, is repressed. But that was really an allegory not only about Victorian repression, but also about high science. It was about the energy science transformations out of Edinburgh and Glasgow in the mid-19th century, where they had theories about a new kind of physics, post-Newtonian physics. What can this bring to us? And they had questions about the nature of energy and entropy, and is the universe always run out of energy, or can you reverse the course and go back to a state of more energy? Can you reverse entropy? Well, the Hyde figure is a classic reverse entropic figure. Can you, like Jekyll, degenerate and then go back? So it's the Gothic facet of high science. One more I'll throw your way is a Scottish text, Robert Blair's 1742 poem, I think, The Grave. All about all these figures that die, everything in life will die and go to the grave. The graves are great end. It's a very lengthy poem that has lengthy catalogs, how they will die and who will die. The answer is everybody, in any way you can imagine. Edgar Allan Poe loved that poem so much. I've read, maybe I'm wrong, I've read that he memorized it word for word. So you find traces of Blair's influence even in Poe a century later in America. Have you read something about that? Do you know about that? Because you know a lot more about Poe than I do.
I haven't read anything about that recently, and if I have in the past, I've forgotten, but I'm going to follow up on that. It sounds very interesting. Dennis Perry might know a little bit about that, but we won't call on you right now.
Yes, certainly he knew his graveyard poets. Can I pick up on a strand of something?
Of course.
Matt said, because I see time is ticking away, and I know one question you and I discussed as we thought about today was, why do these stories persist? The Gothic will not go away. I mean, here it is. We have it in films. We have it in video games. We have it in Twilight. We have, it won't go away. And I'm sure there are many ways of answering that question. But a thought that I had this afternoon, maybe it doesn't answer it, maybe it just intensifies the question, is that there's something about some of these stories that's mythic, that hits us deep down. But if you think about the Gothic stories that have really lasted, Jekyll and Hyde is one. What texts come to mind? Frankenstein, A Christmas Carol, Gothic in its way. Anyway, you can go down the list. All of them have become more than books. They've become culture texts that, appropriately for books and stories about monsters, have taken on a life of their own and propagated themselves in lots of different media and so on. What is it about these texts, right? Matt says Stevenson's picking up on worries of modern science. Well, you got to go back to Frankenstein and say, okay, bingo, right?
Good.
This is our first modern parable about technology that may be going wrong, right? About maybe mankind overstretching its bounds. And Mary Shelley's been reading about new experiments in electricity and all this kind of stuff, right? What if human beings could create life? That's horrifying. And so we've got this whole genealogy of texts that grows out of Frankenstein, right? The Island of Dr. Moreau, Brave New World, right? Scientific overreacher stories, science gone wrong, the horrors of the modern world that we're creating and unleashing, right? Go to a story like A Christmas Carol. What's scary there? There are a lot of things you can say, but whatever else you say, we've got this modern, industrial, commercial society which seems to revolve around greed and self-interest, right? And what's the solution to it? The ghosts come to tell us, right? And as long as that's a problem that's deep in our societal DNA, the story speaks to us, right? So I think that that's how these stories work. You know, it's stuff that we at once desire and fear. Stuff that we get excited about, but we also get really terrified about. And somehow it manages to embody all of those contradictions.
You know, thank you. That was a very interesting comment about that. And one of the things that that you made me think about, Paul, and Matt too, with your comment about Jekyll and Hyde, is how often we retell that story. You know, that we adapt these stories across media. And tell them over and over and over again. I mean, I know that I couldn't list all the Jekyll and Hyde things off the top of my head, but am I mistaken? Is there a Broadway musical based on Jekyll and Hyde? There's a BBC series, I believe it's called Jekyll. There's an old film, I think from the 50s, that I believe is called Dr. Jekyll and Ms. Hyde, where he turns into a woman monster, right? This kind of thing. And that's probably hardly any of them, really. But we retell these stories over and over and over again. And I want to mention one more. I mean, Stephen King novels. I mean, Stephen King has been around long enough that his stories have been adapted and readapted and readapted and so on. And I'm thinking of the story of his first novel, Carrie, which has been a Broadway musical. It has been an off-Broadway play. It's been adapted into film 3 times, a miniseries, sequels. And one of the questions that I often ask myself, and this ties into your comment, is why do we tell these stories over and over again? And part of me thinks it's not to master them. It's because maybe we want the uncertainty of some of these stories, right? Carrie doesn't, I mean, this isn't a discussion about Carrie, but it doesn't end well. And we don't focus on that story because we hope it'll end differently. We are, in some ways, are troubled and yet intrigued by the mysteriousness of it, right? I want to ask a very horrible, horrible question as kind of a concluding question, then I'm going to open it up for questions.
The more horrible, the better.
Yeah.
Oh dear.
What are some of our current, and I'm going to say European, what are some of our current European ghosts? And I know that's an awful broad question, but think of maybe one or two. And just what specters, in the language of Marx, what specters haunt Europe?
So Marx says it's the specter of communism.
Yes, he does. Yeah.
Which still haunts Europe,
Yeah.
right? But in a different way from what he intended. One thing that comes to mind, and there are no doubt people in the room that know more about this than I do, but we've got the specters of the Second World War, which are related, right, with this project of unified Europe and trying to figure all this stuff out. But now we've got video games that not only have zombies, but have Nazi zombies, right?
Yeah.
We do indeed.
That's a pretty
They're
apparent
pretty fun,
example.
too, but yeah.
Yeah, well, no, I think Paul's on the right. I mean, there are lots of these. I mean, Europe itself is a very old country. I mean, you know, I think that famous line in Ulysses by James Joyce, you know, where Stephen Dedalus, one of the protagonists, says, you know, history is a nightmare for which I'm trying to awake, which is, I mean, this is the history itself is overwhelming, I think, in some of these older nations in a way that's felt very palpably by a lot of the people who live there. One of the manifestations of that, I was thinking as Paul was talking about the Marxian phrase about the specter of communism. Derrida, who wrote the book Spectres of Marx, about the 1990s, not only was the Gothic interesting, I think, in British literary criticism, it also made a resurgence in sociology and in philosophy, and a lot of books about specters and spectrality. In fact, one of the words that was used about Derrida's own work was hauntology, the study of that which haunts. And Derrida attached that to the project of the phenomenon of mourning, grieving over things that are dead, and he attached that in turn to all possibilities for representations. The very use of language are evoking things that are not here. You mentioned that Scott Springer is not here. Well, we know who Scott is. Scott's not here. Scott, therefore, to Derrida, exists even were he not to be here ever again. Of course, he will be. But that means that in our very use of language, according to Derrida, there's something haunted about how we speak, which suggests at some level that the very idea of things Gothic, of things dead, are a part of our everyday use of language, how we think, how we experience the world. In other words, you'd be hard-pressed to find things in Europe that are not Gothic, according to sort of Derrida and deconstructionists.
Yeah. Ontology is a pun, right? Hauntology. Punning, haunting, and ontology. So it means
Wonderful.
to be is to be haunted,
Good.
right? Ontology.
You're making me think about, some people have also picked up these issues, I think Derrida does as well, with technology, things like phones. Your phone rings and you pick up the phone and there's a voice there, a disembodied voice, right? You're speaking to a ghost. I mean, maybe not in the most literal sense, but think about it. I mean, I find it awfully bizarre when someone calls me on my cell phone and I have a picture of them and there's that face and this voice, but they're not there. And I'm like, who is this talking to? A ghost?
And
right?
that was how people reacted to the first photographs.
Sure,
Right?
yeah.
You can now have a trace of someone who's absent or is even dead. That's how people reacted to the first phonography, right? The
Yeah.
first sound recording. So I do think as long as we have these technological changes that are unsettling, also we'll have new forms for this old kind of literature to take.
Thanks. I'm going to transition over to questions here, and I want to say two things, and I'll be brief. The first thing is, it's a question. Can you tell that there's a lot to say about the Gothic? Can you tell there's a lot to say about it? It's a fascinating subject, and one, as our speakers have pointed out, one that has sometimes been cast aside as not being all that interesting. But it turns out it is interesting. And the other thing that you've learned, I hope today, so far anyway, is that the Gothic can be approached through multiple disciplinary, I'm looking for the word
Angles.
aspects, angles, thank you. And I wrote down a very short list, but I'm thinking of things like history, psychology. I'm thinking of things like social sciences. I'm thinking about things, I also wrote down philosophy, cultural studies, gender studies, and so on. It is a seemingly inexhaustible topic. Now, in that vein, we'd love it if you asked us some questions. And so I'm going to invite members of the audience to line up. And is there just the one microphone here? Would interested members of the audience line up and ask some questions of us? We would love it. So I'll give you just a second to start lining up.
This was very easy to watch.
Bruce Young,
Last
yeah. Yeah.
You talked a lot about the origins of Gothic, or the association of Gothic with historical change or trauma or psychological sorts of things. But aren't there some literary antecedents, for example?
No, Bruce, there are none.
Shakespeare does not come into the discussion. No, it actually does.
That's right.
For
Hamlet's
example,
Ghost.
Elizabethan and Jacobean drama,
Hamlet's
which from the 1580s to the 1630s, maybe peaking in the 1610s and 20s, revenge tragedy, especially with incest, dismemberment, murder, madness, etc.
Macbeth.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Walpole, when he writes the preface to Otranto, I should back up and say, the first Gothic novel doesn't initially admit that it is a Gothic novel. Okay, so Walpole pretends he's found this old medieval manuscript and he's
Right.
just translated it, right? But people, call his bluff, and in the second edition, that's when he calls it a Gothic story, and he appends this explanation of what he's trying to do. Okay, and his explanation is he's trying to reconcile the old kind of improbable romance with modern kind of realist probability, and he says my warrant for doing this is Shakespeare. Now, of course, anytime someone wants to do something controversial, their warrant for doing it is Shakespeare, right? Because he's the one indisputably canonical figure. But I mean, clearly, this stuff doesn't come out of nowhere, right? We don't just have to point to Shakespeare, but ghost stories, A Winter's Tale around the fireside at Christmas time goes a long way back.
Well, the very idea of a found manuscript.
Or a found manuscript,
which is rife with folklore and legend.
Yeah, so, I mean, certainly it comes trailing clouds of earlier literature. Why does
trailing
it...
clouds of sulfur.
Clouds of sulfur. Why does it materialize in the way it does? I think we've hinted at some of these things. Gothic does seem to be, in its fully realized form, a creature of modernity. Modernity defined with a capital M, I think. And I think it deals with problems that seem more or less unique to modernity. But I'd be willing to be talked out of that.
Well, under that name, maybe, right? But
Yeah.
there might have been, well, that's a debate for another session, but yes, please.
You mentioned some of the cultures that adopted a Gothic tradition, but were there any in Europe that tried to repress it?
I'm not sure you could adopt it without first trying to repress it. As I see it, it emerged really as the manifestation or sign of some kind of prior indication of an attempted repression. In other words, I think that to see the Gothic is already to sort of locate a repression, right? So the question, I guess, if there were no Gothic, it means you'd find a country that was so liberated there was no repression. That would be interesting. I'd love to see what that looked like. I can't imagine it myself.
Yeah, the only thing that comes to mind for me is not so much that Gothic fiction was banned or suppressed or that the books were burned or anything like that, although I'm sure Matthew and Lewis's books came close to that.
The Monk. Yeah.
The Monk, it's pretty racy, that book. But I do think there's something to think about in terms of revolutionary politics and counter-revolutionary politics, if only for this reason. When people were worried about the Gothic in sort of 1790s, early 1800s England, it wasn't just the content of the books that they were worried about. It was the existence of the books itself. Because what they represented as these incredible blockbuster, best-selling books was this new power of mass literacy, which seemed to be part of what was driving the events just across the English Channel. Right? And the worry was print is getting into the wrong hands, upper class, lower class, right? It's out of control. There are subversive energies that seem to be going into these texts. Do you see what I mean? And so the fact that people were reading these books all over the place was scary in itself. And so when you hear people criticizing the books, that there's this hint of political panic, not just panic about the content of the books.
Thank you.
Hi. I think it's interesting that if you look at, say, Gothic architecture, it goes from being this idea and concept of light to the more modern concept of Gothic literature as dark, repressive, bones in the closet. How did this transformation take place?
Great question. You want to start?
No.
I can only speculate.
I can think about things that are written in the 19th century about Gothic architecture, but I don't know. But your question's about origins, and I don't know if I can answer that question.
Yeah. But here's the thing. The setting of a Gothic story isn't a Gothic cathedral. It's a ruined Gothic cathedral. Okay. It's a ruined Gothic abbey. I think that tells you a lot in itself. Maybe that's an evasion of the question, right? But it's about past. It's about things that are ruined, right? It's about histories that people have tried to erase more or less successfully. Right?
Or that have erased themselves.
Or that have erased
the very
themselves.
definition of a ruin, one definition at least would be an edifice of culture returning back into nature. Decay, corruption, et cetera. And in that respect, even nature itself as an organic force buries or represses her own, right?
Yeah.
Stones, are turned into bricks and returned back to stone. In that respect, I suppose history itself is an obscuring force. I'm just right.
Well, and it becomes a parable for the vanity of human endeavors in general.
Yeah, is that right?
Right. Everything
Right.
passes away.
Ozymandias.
Religion is just one small part of this story of things that may or may not be passing away, right? That this culture is trying to wrestle with.
Thank you.
In some ways, if I may comment too, in some ways your question is hard in the sense that we use similar words to describe different things, that there may be continuity between them. But a Gothic cathedral and a Gothic novel may have things in common, but also will have differences, right? And I'm also thinking about, like, at your local high school, you have Goths, and what is their relationship
Carl used to be one, but he cleaned himself up for
exactly,
today.
right? I mean, my fingernail paint is still in my car, but the word is easy to apply, hard to define.
Carl, one of my favorite skits for Saturday Night Live, back in the Will Ferrell days, had Will Ferrell playing a goth. Okay, and he's a goth, and he has a boombox, and he turns on the boombox, plays goth music. The music he's playing is Celine Dion's song from Titanic. Yeah, which is great. The surrealists would love that moment, I'm sure, yeah.
Yeah, that's great.
I had one other thought.
Sure.
Do we have time to go back to this question?
We do have time, and then we have another question.
Here's a curiosity of 18th century British culture. Okay, so first half of the century, if you were designing a garden on your estate, you would probably put up a fake Greek temple. Okay.
And a grotto.
Yes, and a grotto and whatever. The second half of the century, you weren't building a classical temple to Diana. You were building a fake Gothic ruin. This is in part a nationalist gesture, right? This is a way of saying we are breaking from classical novels and we're moving into a new kind of art, an art that represents our native tradition, native energy,
right.
and so on, right? And so that is one of many reasons for tapping back into Shakespeare and Chaucer and Milton, right? You're trying to trace out a genealogy for modern literature that is, in Britain's case, uniquely British, okay? And another aspect of this, of course, is that you're defining that which is British as that which is not French, right? We're at war with France, and therefore, what is English is that which is not Catholic, among other things. And so that's another twist on this whole religious aspect. And the way Catholicism comes into these stories, but usually in sort of parodic forms, dark forms.
Thank you. Next question.
Okay, so you've discussed the ways monsters are kind of personifications or monsterifications of our fears as a culture or a society or things like that. So I'm wondering, if we're putting that in a modern context, what would you say our fears are that are manifest through these sorts of, through zombies?
Vampires and werewolves?
Actually, zombies is what I'm wondering about.
You want to take this? You know more about zombies than I do.
I would love to take this,
Go.
but I don't have to. But if you guys want to chime in on this, but zombies, things like zombies, there's now I'm getting tongue-tied. I wanted to answer the question as just blah, 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 right?
That is how zombies talk usually.
Exactly, right? Brains and more brains, and they. But the most common response to the zombie rage, the popularity of zombies in our culture today, is that zombies represent mindless consumerism. Now, I say this is the most common, and there are scholars that are trying to figure out if there are other interesting things to say about zombies.
Yeah.
And there may be and there may not be. I tend to think that we're running out of steam, but I'm hoping that there will be a new wave of interest. But the thing that got us thinking about that the most was George Romero's film Dawn of the Dead, where the zombies are, they come back to life and they're wandering around America in a shopping mall. And it's very funny. And Romero's point is that if we were to die and come back to life through some mysterious process, which would shop. I mean, we're zombies and we're looking for food and whatever, but we just go shopping because that's where we inhabit, that's the space we tend to inhabit the most. There's a rage for zombies right now. And again, there has to be more to say about this.
Consumer culture eats
Well,
our
yeah.
minds.
Consumer culture eats our minds.
Well, there's something religious about that too, and the idea of sort of shopping malls, consumerism, savings. I had a teacher at UCLA who used to talk a lot about consumer savings and traditional Christian ideas about salvation.
That's
These were
great.
Connected to each other. So the religion thing comes back in the form of
Okay.
the mall.
This is getting really distressing. I had a student write a really smart paper about this a couple of semesters ago. And his argument was that the first surge of zombie fiction was right after Vietnam. I don't know anything about that, but that's interesting too.
That can't be right.
Sorry, Trent. I tried to give him a shout out.
Oh, sorry, am I insulting someone inadvertently?
I don't know if he's here or not. but,
okay.
It seemed plausible the way he argued it.
Maybe a surge, maybe like a critical mass or something, but there are zombie texts dating back to the 19th century and also prior to Vietnam.
They simply came back.
Yeah.
They came
He was
back.
just-
Exactly.
There was a surge.
Yeah.
There was a troop buildup of zombies.
But Vietnam, of course.
The body count was rising. Okay, I'll stop.
Please, yeah, okay. Next question.
So you've talked a lot about how how ghosts in Gothic times represent this repression of unwanted thoughts. But do you see that them being representative of anything else, like an obsession with the supernatural, or?
Well, yeah, sure. So one of the things, coming back to the point about psychoanalysis, if you look at Freud, who's giving us a lot of our concepts of the unconscious and of repression and of why we repress and how we repress and what happens when we do repress. Freud, again, if you look at the Freudian case histories, have a very Gothic element. You could say that these very explanations themselves are merely Gothic texts or fictions, representations in some other form. In that respect, our language of repression already indicates an obsession with ghosts and the supernatural we simply can't quite get rid of. And so we invent a vocabulary scientifically to talk about it that legitimates our fascination with ghosts, one could say.
Thank you.
I believe we're almost out of time for questions. Is there any burning question that you just have to ask before I tie this off? Yeah.
Wait.
It's always dangerous when political scientists ask about literature. So, but I was thinking about someone like Tolkien in the UK case. Tolkien, one of the things he said about the fantasy novels that he wrote was that he regretted the fact, or at least it appeared a fact from his point of view, that England, Britain, lacked the kind of heroic past that some of the other European nations had easily, readily at hand, and that he thought it was his task to set about inventing some of that. And I just wonder whether that brand of fantasy has anything in common with the Gothic as the two of you have described it.
I'll let Paul handle
Yeah,
this.
that's a tricky question.
Yeah, good
because
question.
usually, the pasts that we're exploring in the Gothic novels are not heroic ones. But I do think it's at least a noteworthy coincidence that there are, growing up at the same time as Gothic literature, attempts in the British tradition to create a kind of national mythology. And the most famous example of that is a Scottish one, right? It's the Ossian poems. And maybe maybe Matt wants to speak to this, but the whole idea of this was trying to recover a certain kind of literary history that's quickly vanishing, right, as we move into modernity, into an age of print. Right, and you can understand this alongside lots of other projects at the time. The Grimm brothers going out and trying to collect German folk tales before they're all gone, right? Ballad collections, folk tale collections, all this kind of stuff, I think is trying to create a kind of national past, even if you have to create it out of nothing, right? And of course there were huge debates over the authenticity of these things. And so when Horace Walpole writes this novel and says, oh, I found this manuscript, right? It's tied up with this larger controversy that's been going on about found artifacts, okay, and past that may or may not be real.
And I just say one thing to your question. About, early 20th century, André Breton, I think it is in France, writes an essay where he talks about the castle problem. And the castle problem is that he said in Gothic novels, they had found an object, this symbol, so potent that it spoke to a set of desires and pasts that we no longer had, alas. We must reinvent our own modern castle. It's a variation of the kind of thing you're talking. Alas, we don't have an heroic history that we have to invent something, or they had it back then. And what they called it was not the hero, but the castle, as a way to sort of suggest grandeur falling into ruin. That's what they said. In the early 20th century, we moderns. We need our own Gothic castles.
Wonderful. Thank you. Let's thank our speakers, Matt Wickman, Paul Westover.